Welcome to the Western Ohio PBIS Network podcast. My name is Brandy Stiegel. You are watching video 6 of the 7-part video series that's going to help your Tier 2 PBIS team put in those systems and supports that are going to help students that are in need of Tier 2 interventions. This video is going to focus on social skills intervention groups. After this video, you will understand how to identify implementation components of a social skills intervention group. You will be able to describe students who are most likely to benefit from a social skills intervention group. You will know how to design a social skills intervention that is contextually relevant for your students and school, but still adheres to the implementation of those critical features of social skills intervention groups. You will understand how to deliver implementation training according to the audience needs. You will understand how to determine how you will collect student data and how that data should be graphed. You will understand how to monitor progress and make decisions for students who participate in a social skills intervention group. You will understand how to create a process for fading intervention supports. And lastly, you will understand how to determine criteria for exiting the social skills intervention group intervention. So, social skills intervention groups are designed for students who are first and foremost not responsive to those tier one school-wide universal systems and supports that are in place and are being implemented with fidelity. And I emphasize being implemented with fidelity because before embarking on any tier two PBIS implementation planning, the team needs to really understand how well those tier one universal supports that have been put in place by the tier one team are being implemented, and if they're being implemented school wide and with fidelity. Social skills intervention groups are good for students who are designed for students who do not require more immediate individualized intervention, meaning their behavior is not severe enough that they require or warrant those tier three interventions and supports. It's designed for students whose behaviors are observed across multiple settings or in multiple contexts. Social skills intervention groups is primarily for those students who demonstrate social skills acquisition and deficits. So there are many reasons for students to have social skills deficits. One reason could be a lack of knowledge, meaning they have never been taught that social skill, they've never learned that social skill, and so they have a lack of knowledge about how to demonstrate that skill. It could be because of a lack of practice, that student has been taught that skill, but has not had the opportunity to become fluent and move through those phases of learning because they have not had the adequate practice or the opportunity to practice demonstrating that skill. It could be because of a lack of cues that the adult or the staff or whoever is not giving the cues on when and where for that student to or that child to demonstrate and use that particular social skill. It could be because of a lack of reinforcement, meaning that there is a lack of feedback being provided via specific positive feedback when the student demonstrates that skill to help that student connect that specific positive feedback or that specific praise to that skill, to them demonstrating that skill, which is going to be help increase the likelihood that they'll use that skill in the future, or not receiving corrective feedback to use behavioral errors as opportunities to reteach. There's a lack of reinforcement of that skill being taught. And then lastly, it could be because there is a presence of a competing problem behavior, which we'll discuss here in a second. So there are several types of social skills deficits. One type of social skill deficit is an acquisition deficit. That means the student does not know the skill or how to use that skill appropriately. The social skill deficit could be because of a performance or a fluency deficit. That means the student can perform the skill, but chooses not to or does so infrequently. And then another reason for a social skills deficit could be because there is a competing problem behavior. That means that another problem behavior interferes with the student's performance of a learned skill. So there's something else that is going on that's preventing them from using and performing a particular learned skill. So, this concept of using explicit instruction of social skills as an intervention for those students that are not responding to tier one universal supports is grounded in several research supported theories. So, social skills intervention is grounded in the social learning theory, it's grounded in applied behavior analysis, and it's grounded in cognitive behavioral approaches. So, I advise tier two teams, I advise PBIS teams in general to really dig into some of this research to help you create those systems based on evidence and research that are going to be sustainable and help you achieve those outcomes that you are hoping for with your PBIS implementation. So there are several key principles that are associated with the use of social skills as an intervention. Some of those principles are that social skills are learned behaviors. Another principle is that social skill deficits can be due to acquisition or performance deficits. Social skills include specific verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Another principle is that social skills require both initiations and responses. Social skills are interactive by their very nature. Another principle is that social skills are highly contextual and depend on the environment. So, specific social skills are needed in specific environments. And lastly, social skills deficits can be identified and they can be treated via instruction. So, teaching social skills is most effective when using an explicit instructional approach. Teaching social skills involves using the same instructional techniques that we use in that school wide tier one social curriculum when we are explicitly teaching those skills and we are monitoring their use of those skills and providing that feedback for the usage of those skills. Students in social skills intervention groups are going to participate in lessons that are going to be supplemental or in addition to their instruction they're receiving in that tier one tier one PBIS, which is basically that universal social skills curriculum. Students in these social groups are going to be given more opportunities for practice. They're going to receive more cueing and more specific positive feedback to correct the use of those social skills that they are learning. So, social skills intervention instruction follows a specific instructional approach. We start off with instruction by telling. We are providing that coaching, we're explicitly teaching that skill. The next step is the show, where we are going to model that skill. The next step is the do. They are going to do role playing. They're going to do role playing to help them learn and acquire that skill. The next thing, they're going to practice that skill. They're going to give opportunities to rehearse those skills in those small group sessions in that situated learning. The next thing is that they're going to be monitored for their progress in learning and applying that skill. And then lastly, they're going to be given more instruction and more opportunities to move that skill into generalization and maintenance. So let's do a quick overview of the social skills intervention. So, first, students are identified as needing additional behavioral support in the area of social skills. We talked about in earlier videos that it's very important that when the tier two team is planning the systems and practices for their tier two PBIS implementation, that they have a process in place for identifying students that are in need of tier two. And then once they identify those students in need of tier two interventions, that they are identifying the function of that behavior so that they can appropriately match those students to an intervention. Once a student has been matched in need of social skills intervention instruction, then those students are then going to be grouped based upon their need. And again, that team's going to really need to do some planning when they are implementing a particular intervention. One thing about social skills intervention groups is this is one of those interventions that is appropriate regardless of what the function of the behavior is. So once that team has identified that a student is in need of social skills intervention, they also have to have a process in place to identify what those social skills deficits are so that they can group those students for instruction based on that social skills. And we'll talk about that in a second here. So then after they have grouped those students based upon those social skills needs, they're going to gather lessons to teach those areas, those skills that they need to do. The co-facilitator is going to use those lesson plans to introduce and practice each of those skills during those small group social skills sessions. The student demonstration and performance of skill is going to be regularly prompted and recognized by all adults in that child's environment. So that facilitator is going to work with the staff and all the adults that interact with that child rather, to help them understand what to look for and how to know what skill that student should be demonstrating. And then student data is going to be collected, it's going to be generated on a frequent basis rather, to monitor the student's progress and to make decisions about the interventions, the student's response to that intervention. So there are several things to think about when creating these social skills intervention groups. So some of the components of the social skills intervention groups is one, that social skills intervention groups include smaller numbers of students with access to higher rates of adult attention. Okay. Social skills intervention groups include situated learning. They are going to include positive peer models. Social intervention groups require systematic, explicit instruction in those social skills. It's going to involve modeling, role playing, problem solving, and feedback on demonstration of those skills. It's going to require a school to home communication. And another component is going to be that social skills intervention groups require students to do some self assessment and recording of their own progress. So when the team is creating their tier two implementation and deciding upon which interventions they want to use, they really need to have a systematic method to identify the students that will be good candidates for social intervention groups. Students can be identified using existing student data so that may indicate a behavioral concern. So that could be looking at the student's attendance, their office discipline referrals, those classroom minor logs, and identifying behavior that may be happening in the classroom, but they may not warrant an office discipline referral. Um, they can identify students by a nomination by a staff member. So someone that works directly with the students may notice issues before any behavior data could be documented. So they may be having some behaviors or some issues that may not warrant that normal documentation. It may be an internalizing behavior, such as they're shy, they're anxious, they're worried, they're withdrawing. There may be something that a data collection may not identify. So we want to have our staff members understand how they can nominate students that may benefit from social skills intervention groups. And then they could use the results from those commercial universal screeners where they are looking at tools and skills that a student should have. And this could be completed by a teacher or a family member, and we'll talk about that later. So there are several roles that need to be filled when implementing a social skills intervention. We're implementing social skills intervention groups as an intervention, as a tier 2 intervention. There's going to need to be an intervention coordinator, and there's going to need to be a social skills group facilitator or facilitators. So the roles and responsibility of the intervention coordinator is to, one, organize resources and supports for effective delivery of those social skills intervention groups. That intervention coordinator is going to train staff and parents for their role in supporting this intervention. And that intervention coordinator is going to be responsible for communicating regularly with the school's tier 2 team, as well as the school staff, and provide information about the number of students participating in social skills intervention groups, the fidelity checks, how well that implementation, this intervention is being implemented during those intervention sessions. What are some maintenance procedures to help students maintain those skills that they're learning outside of those intervention groups? How the students' progress is being monitored, and how well the students that are in that group are responding to that intervention as a whole. And then what are some long-term outcomes and effects that the staff can look to see after that intervention has ended? The social skills group facilitator's responsibility is going to meet at least weekly with a small group of students who demonstrate similar social skills. So they're going to be the persons that are going to be responsible for facilitating those small group instruction sessions. The facilitator is going to be responsible for organizing lesson plans and materials and providing that 30 to 60-minute small group instruction in those social skills in a consistent location, at a consistent time. Um, that facilitator is going to be responsible for communicating to the staff exactly what skills they have taught in each session, the specific steps so students should be demonstrating to be considered successful with the skill, any variations of the skills that can be recognized as reasonable approximations or being close to demonstrating that target behavior or skill. So let's talk about the steps for implementing an effective implementation of the social skills intervention groups. So the first step is to assess, using some process to assess, to identify those common skill deficits that those students that have been identified as good candidates for social skills intervention groups, to identify what those skills deficits are, identify what is common, what are those common skills, whether it's communication, and we'll look at some of the different skills. The next step is to gather lessons. You need to gather all of the lessons that will be used to teach the skills. Step 3 is to plan for generalization and maintenance of those skills once they have been taught. Step 4 is to plan for or establish those session procedures and the guidelines and how those sessions will be implemented. Step 5 is to notify the group participants. Step 6 is to teach the social skill lessons. Then next, their progress will be monitored, student progress will be monitored. And then step 8 is to evaluate the outcomes of that intervention. And we're going to go over each of these steps individually. So the coordinator, the first step of, as we said, is to assess, to identify skills deficits. So the coordinator is the tier 2 team. Again, before implementing this, has already come up with a process of identifying what those social skills deficits are. So now once the coordinator has that data, the coordinator is going to determine the social skills deficits that are most common across most or all members of the students that are in need of the social skills intervention, so that the group students can be grouped and so that lessons can be matched with the needs of those selected students. Again, the purpose of grouping them is so that those facilitators can teach that particular skill to that particular group of students. Again, there are commercially published curricula that provide instruction in social skills. So when you purchase these curricula, more than likely they include a brief rating scale that can be used and completed by teachers, parents, and or students. They can use the results. The coordinator can use the results from these scales to help with identifying the groups and which skills the coordinator needs to focus on are the skills that are most needed. So next, the tier two team should gather the lessons. They have to figure out what lessons they're going to use to create. So the tier two team should consider the most common deficits that students are experiencing and create a bank of lessons that are ready to go that can be organized as soon as the students are identified to participate in the group. So remember, the goal of tier two intervention are to be readily accessible. So that team wants to have a bank of lessons. The lessons should be gathered from a variety of sources or supplement and have ways to supplement and reteach lessons. So that team really wants to be able to gather as many lessons for a particular skill as they can, so that the facilitator has the opportunity to pull from multiple lessons and banks and tools for those lessons that need to be taught. So some things to think about. Here are some common curricula, some examples. There are numbers of curricula that can be purchased. That team really wants to really investigate and research any type of curricula before purchasing it, to understand what the components of that curricula, the resources needed before you purchase anything. So some examples of some curricula would be social skills improvement systems, which was created by Elliott and Gresham in 2008. The categories that they focused on is communication, cooperation, assertion, responsibility, empathy behaviors, engagement, self-control behaviors. Another example is skill streaming, which focuses on classroom skills, friendship making skills, dealing with feelings, alternatives to aggression, dealing with stress. Second steps committee for children. It focuses on empathy, impulse control, and problem solving, anger, and emotion. Another example is accepts, which focuses on classroom skills, basic interaction skills, getting along skills, making friends skills, coping skills. So as you see, all of these commercially available materials focuses on different categories of social skills. So most commercially available curricula materials don't have enough lessons in one category for students to master the skill. There's not enough instruction or lessons to help move those students through those phases of learning. So generalization and maintenance. So the tier two team is going to have to gather a variety of lessons from a variety of sources that they can use to pull from. So as we know, learning happens in phases, and I just want to quickly, briefly discuss those phases of learning to help us understand some of the other processes of these social skills intervention groups. So, of course, we know that the first phase of learning is that acquisition phase. This is where students are first learning a skill. This is where that instructor is going to be providing that direct instruction, where they're going to be explicitly teaching, they're going to be modeling, they're going to give some time for guided practice, independent practice. They're providing that explicit instruction of that skills. This is the first student's exposure to that skill. Then next, after that student has had that adequate instruction, they move into that fluency phase. This is that phase where they have been given the opportunity to practice during that acquisition phase of learning. They are now becoming fluent at demonstrating that skill and having those multiple opportunities to practice the skill. After students move through that fluency phase, they move into that maintenance phase where they are able to use that skill. They are able to use that skill. They're able to use that skill after extended breaks. The next is that generalization skill phase where they are able to use that skill in different settings. And then they move to that adaptation phase where they are still also able to use that skill in other settings outside of the settings that they have learned. So step 3 is to plan for generalization, moving those skills into generalization and maintenance. So one, when teaching skills, use real life examples relevant to that student circumstance. Step 2, if possible, train in the problem settings with peers the students are likely to encounter. Um, Another step is to plan for regular communication with the teachers and the staff as to what social skill lessons are being taught. Encourage those teachers and staff to prompt and provide cues to help the students use that skill. And then step 4 is to provide reinforcements of students' effort and regular feedback, which is going to further increase the generalization of those skills. So step 4 is going to be to establish those session procedures. This should be done prior to beginning the intervention group. As we talk about establishing, just like in the classroom, establishing procedures are going to help the students, are going to maximize the amount of time that that instructor is being able to spend on having to spend and be able to spend on instruction. So the more the students are able to understand the procedures, and then those procedures are able to become routines, that is going to help maximize the amount of time that that instructor has to spend focusing on those skills. So some things to think about is who's going to facilitate the intervention groups, what are the expectations and rules during that groups, and those should always align with those tier 1 universal school-wide expectations. How long will the instructional period last? Will it be 30 minutes? Will it be 60 minutes? When will the instruction take place? So you want to ideally think of a time that's going to be appropriate to pull these students for social skills and intervention groups. And again, this is going to take some planning because we need to understand from what subjects we're pulling them from. Is this time appropriate? What's the most valuable time that we can pull? And again, these students are going to be coming from various classrooms. So it's going to really take some scheduling to understand, some planning in that scheduling to understand how students need to be pulled. Where will this group meet? This needs to be a consistent location so that we're providing that consistency and a space that's conducive for this instruction. And what is the maximum number of children per intervention group? So the next step is to notify parents, notify participants of the group. And so that process, and we're going to go over each of these steps. You're going to notify the teachers of those students that will be participating. That teacher's going to collect baseline data, and then that student's family is going to be notified, and then all of those people, the family and the students, will be introduced to that intervention. So the first thing, the teachers, classroom teachers are the first participants to be notified when a student is identified as a possible candidate for social skills intervention groups, in order for that teacher to help that team collect that initial baseline data, which is going to verify if that student is or is not an appropriate candidate for that intervention. So that teacher is the first line of defense because they're going to be the first persons that provide that data that that team's going to need to match that student to an intervention. The team should collect 3 to 5 days of baseline data using a daily progress report before a student begins this intervention. so that you have enough data to help, number one, determine if the intervention is appropriate, but number two, use as that baseline data. So after the data is collected, that tier two team is going to review it to determine whether the student truly needs that additional support. Um, they're going to use that data to set an initial daily, weekly point goal that is going to be reasonable for that student to achieve. And then the level of teacher commitment for that implementation. Remember, we really have to train our staff on implementing any of these interventions because they are implementers and will be implementing whatever intervention in that classroom. So we need to make sure that they are very committed to helping that tier two team provide these supports and interventions. So the next step is going to be introducing the intervention. So the coordinator or the facilitator is going to provide an explanation and details about the purpose of the intervention and the process for participating in the intervention. During this meeting, the social skill curriculums that's going to be used or those lessons are going to be described. They're going to talk about the opportunities for recognition of success and what those look like. They're going to talk about the responsibility of each participant and that those roles are going to be clarified. And then the information about how that student will be faded to a self-management plan or how they will be graduated from the intervention is going to be provided. So the next step is going to be to teach those social skills lessons. So again, remember that process during each lesson. They're going to always start with reviewing those previous skills that were taught. They're going to teach the new skill by telling. We're going to go through the modeling or the show. We're going to give the do or the practice time. We're going to provide that positive and corrective feedback and then give the students opportunity to opportunities for more practice and then more feedback and then plan for the generalization and maintenance of those skills. And so it's very important that we look into those lesson plans to make sure all of these components are there. So step 7, we are, after those skills have been taught, the student's progress is going to be monitored using those daily progress reports. So the tier 2 team should create a progress report that teachers will complete daily where they're looking for the demonstration of those skills that are being taught. The daily progress report should list social skills and any steps related to the skills that are being learned during those group meetings. We'll look at a progress report here shortly. Teachers should use that daily progress report to document ratings of student skill performance. And the team is going to be very intentional when creating those daily progress reports. That daily progress report is going to serve as the primary method for monitoring students' response to the social skill intervention. So it's going to be very important that those progress reports are completed accurately and that data is collected. So let's take a look at a social skills intervention group daily progress report. And as you can see, these look a little different than your check-in and check-out reports. These are a lot more detailed and they're going to require more information. So here's an example of a report. So again, it has the student's name, the team's name, which group they're participating in, the day that that progress report is being collected or completed. It gives a brief description. So the student is participating in our social group. The target social skills are listed below. Using the provided criteria, rate the student's use of the individual skill each day. So it's giving directions on how to look at the skill or how to complete this document. So then here we have the rating. Again, every report, daily progress report should include the ratings and what those rating scales mean. It has the school-wide expectations. Remember, your tier 2 expectations should be aligned with the tier one. So in this case, it's be respectful, be responsible, be safe, be a learner. And then we have the skills in this column that we are learning in those groups, in those particular groups. So in this case, it's getting along with others, making compromising, staying calm when receiving feedback, be responsible. The skills we're learning are following directions, paying attention to work, be safe is keeping hands and feet to yourself. Be a learner means they are participating, completing assignments. So all of the skills that they're learning in those social skills groups, or that they have learned. Then you have across the top this time frame. So this is going to be looking different depending on that student's schedule. Then we have the opportunity for that for those ratings, 3, 2, 1 in this case, or not applicable, meaning that that's not a skill that they are looking for. So then in this last column, they are going to total up the points. And so this is an example of that daily progress report. So again, remember that this daily progress report is going to serve as the primary method that's going to be used to collect student data and monitor their progress that um, to that intervention. Once they get that data and they total those points up, that should be entered into some sort of spreadsheet or some sort of information system, so that the data can be graphed to provide that visual representation. Remember, as we discussed in that check-in and check-out video, graphing that data is going to help that team look for trends, and help to monitor their progress towards that goal. Data features to think about when you're looking at those graphs, their level of performance, so how well they're performing. So that's going to be looking at those daily progress points that they're getting and that are being graphed, and that graph. So how well are they moving towards that goal that was set by the team? What's their desired level of performance compared to their current level of performance? How they're moving, looking at that trend line to look how well they're moving towards meeting that goal, and the amount of time it's taking them to meet that goal. So every time for each intervention, every team needs to create a process to identify that student's response to that intervention. And again, check out the check-in and check-out video. We discussed, I'm sorry, the database decision-making video to talk about graphing and collecting student data and student response to intervention. It's very important that whatever intervention you are using, that you are looking at that student's response and you're collecting that data. So when students have consistently been showing a positive response to that intervention, the team wants to begin to thinking about how that student's going to be faded from that intervention and eventually graduated from that intervention. So after completing the formal social skills intervention lessons, and the students have successfully demonstrated those skills, those self-management procedures, the tier two team should organize a graduation or ceremony and provide an opportunity to celebrate that success. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that database decision-making video to understand what fading the graduation means, I highly suggest that you go back and watch that video. So once the tier two team has to come up with the way to figure out how to fade these interventions, and how they are going to promote those self-management procedures in the classroom after graduation has taken place. So as we know, there will be times when students are not having a positive response to an intervention. So some students may be having a questionable response, or they may be having a poor response to an intervention. Some students that participate in social skills intervention group will continue to have difficulties during the intervention, as well as after that group ends. So there are several things to do for those students who did not respond in a positive way to those social skills instructions. And so several things that that team can do is to manipulate the antecedent conditions or manipulate the consequence conditions. So manipulating the antecedent condition means that change that someone or they're changing the team is changing one or more events that typically occur before problem behaviors occur. And again, if you are not familiar with um, the ABCs of behavior, I highly advise that you go back and start at video 1 because we discussed this throughout all of these videos. So that teacher or that staff member is going to change one of the things or the things that happen before the behavior occurs. The teacher should identify particularly problematic time periods or activities that occur during the student's school day, then provide those pre-corrects or those cues to help the students know to demonstrate that behavior. Using a pre-correct is going to allow the teacher and student to have a positive interaction that is going to be focused on that expect teaching, prompting or reminding that student to use that expected behavior prior to demonstrating that problem behavior. Those pre-corrects are going to reduce the likelihood of the problem behavior because we've reminded you of what that expectation was before it. So pre-corrects are considered an antecedent. Remember that antecedent is going to be what prompts the behavior that occurs. So we can do things to control the behavior by controlling the antecedents. So another suggestion for students that are not responding to the instruction or not demonstrating the skill is to manipulate the consequences or the conditions. So manipulating the consequence condition means that that there is a change in one or more events that are typically occurring immediately after that problem behavior. Remember, consequences can be positive or negative consequences. Consequences are the consequences that occurs immediately after the behavior are going to either make the behavior more likely to occur again. So positive consequences, um, negative consequences, whatever, are going to either make the behavior more likely to occur again, maintain the behavior, or decrease the likelihood that the behavior is going to occur again. So in that case, you can change the consequence that happens when a student demonstrates a problem behavior. So those consequence conditions could be teacher response, planned ignore, whatever consequence the teacher had been using when a behavior occurs, that can be adjusted. And it's very important that teachers are trained in those effective classroom practices um, so that they understand how to respond to behavioral errors and how to encourage appropriate behavior. So, consequence conditions can be arranged to minimize reinforcement for problem behavior and maximize reinforcement for appropriate behavior. So, we can change the way we respond to behavior to decrease the likelihood that that problem behavior is going to occur, continue to occur, and increase the likelihood that that appropriate behavior is going to happen again. And that's going to be very important that that team thinks about what those consequences are, and that teachers have been trained how to use those in that classroom. So, whenever we are implementing an intervention, it's very important to provide the staff, the students, and the families with training around that intervention. So, training about the social skills intervention groups should be provided for all staff members. Um, the level of detail needed and the time frame for providing training is going to vary to the extent of which that staff member has to participate. But all staff need some level of training around social skills intervention groups. So, some training that should happen, some training topics that should be included for all staff. Should be, what is the intervention? What is the name of the intervention in your building? Who is coordinating and facilitating that intervention? How children are going to be identified to participate in that intervention, and the maximum number of students that can be served at one time. So this is just a brief overview of that intervention. And this can happen again during staff meetings, very brief session, just to give an overview of that. It can happen during professional development days, but again, it's a very brief overview of that intervention. Some training for staff who are directly involved with those students that are participating in those social skills intervention groups. Some topics include what skills that are going to be taught during each lessons and the steps that they're going to be needing for completing those skills. How those teachers or those adults or those staff can use those pre-correct prompts and cues to help ensure that those students are going to demonstrate those skills that they're learning. And then lastly, how to give specific and give positive specific feedback, and how to give corrected feedback while they're observing those students demonstrate those skills. So giving that positive specific feedback when they see students demonstrating those skills, or giving that corrective feedback when they see students are not demonstrating those skills. So some training for teachers that interact with those students participating in that social skills intervention group is first, how to complete a daily progress report. Remember, that is going to be one of the primary methods for collecting data. So teachers really need to understand how to complete that report. Where to submit student data that they may have, those classroom minors, any documentation that they may be collecting on students, how to interpret response to intervention data. So they need to be able to be kept abreast of that student's data. So that coordinator and that facilitator should be sharing that data and those graphs so that the teachers understand how well the students are responding. Teachers need to understand how to support the self-management procedures that the students learned in those social intervention groups. They need to understand who they need to contact if they need assistance with that student or implementing any of those skills. And then lastly, they need to, again, be kept abreast of the progress of those students that are participating in the group. So the training for the students and the family, students should be provided instruction about that daily progress report. The students should periodically see and receive feedback about their data. So they should have conferences. There should be student conferences to discuss their performance and help them set goals and help them be able to reflect on what they need to do to meet their goals. Families should be informed of skills that will be taught and how that daily progress report is going to be used to monitor their child's performance, how often that they are going to be receiving data about their child's progress, and how they can support that data or how they can support those skills at home. So the next thing to think about is how that team is going to monitor the fidelity of the intervention. So just like with any intervention, it's important to monitor the fidelity to ensure that it's being implemented properly, so that when we're looking at students' response to the intervention, we know if the student is not responding because of a deficit and we need to do some problem solving, or they're not responding because the intervention is not being implemented with fidelity. So several things that a team could do to monitor the fidelity of this implementation is look at a permanent product review, which we'll discuss here in a second, or they can use direct observation using a fidelity checklist. So when we talk about permanent product review, we're looking at lesson plans. Those lesson plans can be reviewed to look at components of that lesson plan to see how those social skills were taught, to see how students were instructed on those social skills. So to look at fidelity of the that product, the team can look at the review of those previously learned skills and discussion of homework. So how are they reviewing those skills that they previously learned and giving those opportunities to practice? Remember, with all of our skills, we should always give those students practice and more practice. They can look at how the skill was introduced and how that skill was explained. They can look at the explicit steps that facilitator used to provide instruction. They can look at the activities that they use to model and provide that role playing opportunity. They could look at how the lessons are incorporating guided practice opportunities and how those lessons incorporate goal setting or how the homework is assigned, how what skills that those students are being asked to practice outside of the groups. Another permanent product that can be reviewed is the progress monitoring data, or those daily progress reports. So this could mean reviewing progress monitoring data that is collected. So reviewing that progress monitoring data can help the intervention coordinator understand if the implementers or the teachers understand the systems that support the intervention and whether that intervention is being implemented with fidelity. So they're going to be going back and looking at those daily progress reports to make sure they're completed correctly, and that those teachers understand and those implementers understand how to collect and track that data, which is going to help that tier two team. They're going to understand if they understand the process of using and submitting that data. So system components could mean, do the teachers understand where to access those daily progress reports? Do they understand how often the daily progress reports should be completed and where they should be submitted? When the team is able to look at the notes or comments from the teachers on those daily progress reports, that can help the team to identify what further professional development those implementers may need, or what coaching supports those implementers may need to implement that intervention with fidelity. So another way of monitoring intervention fidelity is to do direct observation of a social skills intervention group. And so, what that person is going to do is take a checklist, and that observer is going to watch that session in process, and they're going to be recording what takes place during a lesson. This is a valuable way to ensure that all the components are provided, that the instruction is appropriate and adequate for those students to learn those social skills. Thank you for tuning into this video. Please don't forget to hit like or subscribe.